past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. Last month, as J1 mentioned, we ran session 2 called Market Systems. My goodness, since then, there's been much discussion in the news, as we've all seen, called Code Red for Humanity announcement from a major UN scientific report that was released. And that authoritative Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report, confirms, no surprise, that climate change is human-caused and forecasts are more precise and warmer for the 21st century. As the head of Plastic Oceans Australasia, which is an environmental NGO, our focus is on reduction of plastic that ends up in our oceans. So you may wonder, what is the connection of this Code Red announcement with today's webinar? I just briefly wanted to mention this to connect it up, as our oceans provide the largest natural carbon sink for greenhouse gases. And sadly, plastic leaves a deadly legacy as it exacerbates the release of methane and ethylene, which in turn increases the rate of climate change. Today's conversation is not only timely, but absolutely imperative, as we cannot make change alone. And on that note, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Howden. Professor Mark Howden is the Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, as I just mentioned, and Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University. He's also a member of the ACT Climate Change Council, and Mark has worked on climate variability, climate change and innovation issues for just a mere 30 years or more. And that's been in partnership, of course, with many industries, community groups and policy groups. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Mark for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Ricky, for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers, particularly J1, for getting us here today. So what I wanted to cover was essentially a bit of a brief history of Australia's climate change action for the last 3 decades or so, and the changing motivations for climate action. So arguably, climate change should be really important to Australia. We're one of the biggest per capita emitters globally. We're also perhaps the developed nation which is most exposed to problematic climate change, as the recent IPCC report indicated, the one that Ricky referred to. It is increasingly clear too that we could also be potentially one of the biggest contributors globally to the transition to a clean energy future, through clean energy exports particularly, but also through technology development that Australia's so good at doing. But if we look back over those 30 years or so that I've been engaged in climate change, it's a very much a mixed report card, with sometimes Australia leading at the forefront of action, sometimes first in the world for doing some things, at other times hesitant, resistant, and nearly last in the pack. So if I go back to where I first engaged on climate change in the Australian context, Australia played a really active role in establishing the Toronto targets in 1988. The target that Australia came back with was a 20% reduction by 2005. That was then adopted in Australian policy in 1990, 2 years later, although there were caveats associated with this should not cost our economy. So we essentially were framing it as action, but only where it's no regrets action. In 1991, we were amongst the first nations to establish a full greenhouse gas inventory across our different sectors. And we also led the development of international inventories, the IPCC OECD inventories. In 1992, when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was developed, Australia was very much at the forefront. We were the 9th country to sign and ratify that convention. Coming back to Australia, what the government did was establish a national greenhouse response strategy, and that was endorsed at what we call the Council of Australian Governments. That's where all governments at all levels come together. So that's the national, state, and local government. So there was clearly widespread agreement in terms of action on climate change. In 1995, we expanded that to add voluntary contributions to that previous strategy. Again, one of the first countries in the world to do so. In 1996, we were one of the first countries to engage in the pilot program for the Activities Implemented Jointly program run out of the UN Framework Convention, which essentially had combinations of tech transfer and emissions trading. So we were there at the forefront. But in 1997, after a change in government, all of this changed. A statement from the government at the time said, adoption of a uniform emissions reduction target would be devastating for the nation. Later that year, the Kyoto Protocol negotiations Australia engaged in led to the infamous Australia Clause, which provided essentially Australia a bit of leeway, as well as allowing Australia to increase our net emissions over the commitment period. Very, very different from our original statements around the Toronto targets. And interestingly, the Kyoto Protocol was only ratified by Australia a decade later upon another change in government. That year, 1997, also saw the implementation of a new policy, which was a 2% renewable electricity target, which subsequently in 2001 was boosted by another 2%. Then it was boosted again to 20% in 2009 after another change in government. Then following another change in government, it was wound back in 2015 and finished, finalised in 2020. And this was in spite of the fact that it was an extraordinarily successful policy in terms of getting renewable energy into our electricity system. In 1998, Australia formed the Australian Greenhouse Office, the first country globally to have a dedicated government agency addressing climate change. The Australian Greenhouse Office mainstreamed climate change into government, what academics would have said was best practice at the time. Unfortunately, it was disbanded only a few years later in 2004. In 1999, an emissions trading scheme was developed federally at the national level, but then put to bed. It was then floated again and again and again until it was made into law in 2011, only to be repealed a few years later in 2014, the first country in the world to wind back a running national emissions trading system. In 2003, Australia implemented perhaps the world's first mandatory emissions trading system in New South Wales, our biggest state. So that was a really big step forward, allowed industry to start engaging in emissions trading. In 2007, we made yet another step forward by having a mandatory industry greenhouse gas reporting requirement at the national level. Again, what we would have thought of as a good practice, if not necessarily the first such program globally. In 2007, there was another change in government, which led to a very active policy period in relation to climate and energy. Amongst other things, an emissions trading system was implemented, a price on carbon established. There were discussions to link the Australian emissions trading system with that of the EU. There was development of the Carbon Farming Initiative, a world first, formation of the Climate Commission, development of the Climate Change Authority, establishment of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. These latter two have had a crucial role in climate change innovation and technology adoption, scaling out solutions to climate change, particularly renewable electricity. In 2013, 2014, after another change in government, the Climate Commission was decommissioned. The emissions trading system, the national one, was repealed. As I mentioned before, the first nation to do so. And instead, a pay the polluters policy was implemented. So we went from extremely progressive policy to policy which often has been criticised. In 2015, the Paris Agreement was negotiated with the Australian position declaring at Paris that we would achieve net zero by 2100. If every other country had declared that, we would be heading towards a world of something like 5 degrees Celsius, temperature above pre-industrial. And in the period post-2015, there's been several attempts to reform the national energy and climate policy landscape, but most of them have failed, often at great political cost. In place, we have things such as the technology roadmap, which lays out some aspirational targets and support for a small handful of the possible options, such as green steel, hydrogen technology, soil carbon technologies, and nature-based solutions. There is growing pressure for policy change for things such as clean fuel standards, to open up Australia to imports of more efficient cars, if we're still running fossil fuel cars, or policies that support rapid adoption of electric vehicles, or reform of the national electricity market to support and accelerate adoption of renewables plus storage. Throughout all of this, there has been turmoil and unpredictable change. There's been multiple changes in policy, multiple changes in institution. Climate change has bounced from one department to another, to another, to another, to another. There's been multiple changes in systems. This is not conducive to investment in new technologies or other systems. And oddly, this has occurred even though there is overwhelming support by the Australian public for more action on climate change. Our longest running survey, the Lowy Institute survey, which covers this, shows that consistently 90% of Australians want more action on climate change. And there's increasing engagement by industry in regional solutions, such as the Sun Cable proposal to export electricity to Southeast Asia, or growing interest in renewable energy exports via hydrogen or ammonia. So when we look back at what really matters to climate change action in Australia, the emission reduction action, the three biggest things that have reduced Australian greenhouse gas emissions are, firstly, land clearing policy, which generates around about 100 million tonnes per annum reductions in emissions. Secondly, penetration of renewables into the electricity market, which saves around about 21 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per annum. And thirdly, the price on carbon, which was only very temporary via the emissions trading system, which generated at the time around about 18 million tonnes per annum reduction. And importantly, right across these three things, it's actually the policy that really matters. There are technologies which support that, which are enabled by the policy, but even the penetration of renewables into the electricity market was largely using known technology, existing technology. So my conclusion is, for effective progress on climate change, we do need technologies, but even more, we need a stable, well-informed and well-directed policy environment which facilitates investment in and use of those technologies in Australia and across our region, because we're all in this together. Thank you.
Gosh, Mark, when I listened to all those different milestones that you went through just now, that was very insightful, having worked in climate change and emissions reduction schemes specifically a few years ago before I was at Plastic Oceans Australasia. And it really is quite mind-blowing to think about how much time, energy and finances have been wasted by the change of the governments, change of implementing a new department and then repealing it and then putting in the policy, repealing, back forward. I'm wondering, why there is so much resistance, even though the people of Australia are asking for our governments to do this, why there is so much resistance for this. And I guess it brings me to the question, one question to you before we, obviously you'll go over to questions in the chat later, but, in your position as Vice Chair of the IPCC, what can we do and what efforts really are going to be needed to position Australia to become climate resilient in the next 5 to 10 years, particularly in government, because obviously that's where we seem to have the biggest hole in consistency. And you're saying that, we need stable policy to be able to deliver the technologies and what you just said. So what would be your take on what we really need to do, and how can we do that?
I think from my view, there's two big things we can do. One is listen to the science. The science is incredibly clear. It's been pretty stable for 20 years or so, and sufficiently to make good decisions on climate change. Within the COVID sort of environment, we consistently hear governments in Australia and elsewhere saying, we take advice from the experts. We believe the models. We have a opening up Australia strategy based on model results. Yet within the climate domain, we have models which are incredibly robust and well tried and tested, calibrated and validated, and yet they're ignored largely in the policy environment. So firstly, listen to the science. It's a really stable basis on which to make good decisions. Not the only basis, because we have to take into account many other things in policy making, but it is a really good start. And secondly, we need to talk with each other. We need to have those conversations which engage people, which take people forward, and they feel that then they're not being left behind, where we can actually engage in just transitions to a better future.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, as you said, we're all in it together and we can't do it alone, which is what I mentioned, in the beginning when I was introducing you. And I know that you're trying to do your bit on a lighter note. I know you're an avid gardener and I know that you grow your own hops for beer. So I know you're trying to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. So that's really fantastic. And I think obviously there'll be some questions that will come to you from our audience. And we've got quite a lot of people listening today in this space. So thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your presentation. It's fantastic to hear your insights after so many years on the job in this space in particular. So what I'll do now is I'll move on to introduce Dr. Dukyu Jung, known as nickname DJ. So I'll do a little intro for DJ, and thank you very much, Mark. So DJ is the Director of the Division of Climate Technology Cooperation Green Technology Centre, and he's been working for over 2 decades and dedicated his life to engineering, innovation and technology transfer related to green growth and sustainable development. This has been based on his research in sustainable waste management. He has designed and implemented bilateral and multilateral partnership projects that facilitate and transition towards circular economy development in developing countries. And he's going to talk today about holistic approach in climate technology transfer projects in Korea, and he is presenting to us from South Korea. Over to you and welcome, DJ.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rinkis, for introducing me so kindly. Hello, so I am Dogu John, Director for Division of the Climate Technology Cooperation, GTC. And I'm very glad to have this chance to talk about the climate technology cooperation. Especially, I will give a presentation on the holistic approach to make the effective technology cooperation. South Korea has been developing several national green policies and projects to actively respond to climate change. Last year, the Republic of Korea officially announced Green New Deal, and the government intends to inject $65 billion in government spending by 2025. After the Green New Deal, the government has been advancing the green schemes such as the carbon neutrality and NDC updates. So we all know that although climate action is essential, it is quite tough to achieve because of technical limitations, financial shortage, and the lack of institutional setup. That is why the international societies and meetings have emphasized the cooperation for the climate action. Recently, Korean governments also highlighted the global cooperation for climate action. At the Leaders Dialogue of P4G Seoul Summit, President Moon Jae-in remarked that advanced countries should enhance support to help shoulder the burdens that developing countries experience for climate action. He also emphasized the key roles of the CTCN Partnership Liaison Office, which will be operating by CTCN with the support of Korean Ministry of the Science and ICT to promote the climate technology transfers between countries. In fact, CTCN has a very critical role in technology cooperation scheme under UNFCCC. UNFCCC has the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism, and CTCN is established to enhance the climate technology cooperation under the technology mechanism. CTCN operates several cooperation programs, such as the technical assistance, knowledge sharing, and capacity building. Today, I would like to underline the importance of holistic approach for climate technology cooperation. In many cases, application of the new climate technology affects many areas and aspects of our society. Therefore, to apply the climate technology successfully, it is important to develop the application scheme, not only in technical aspect, but also institutional, social, and financial aspects. Let me make more details for the holistic approach with two cases of CTCN TA. The first one is Bangladesh TA that we conducted in 2017. At the time, Bangladesh requested a TA to CTCN, and GTC and our partners consulted this TA. Bangladesh looked for the drinking water supply technologies that can solve their water issue with the seawater intrusion to groundwater. When we recommended an optimal technology like reverse osmosis desalination technology to them, we found that actually technical issue is also important, but it is just a piece of crucial challenges. The installation and operation cost for the technical facility using this technology are not cheap. So it is highly challenging to find a way to finance the technical application, especially at the time, Bangladesh doesn't have enough the governance to make the citizen to pay their drinking water cost. So we try to find several ways to finance this technology application in Bangladesh. And then we found that the business linking to carbon market can be a successful solution. So, for example, if the owner of this facility, for example, private sector, can invest installation and operation cost for this facility and make the carbon credit using the lower energy consuming technology. And then they can sell this carbon credit to other countries and having additional revenue to operate this technology in their target market. So we found this innovative solution, and then we did the finance this scheme with the additional the grant program with the KOICA project, and then we did it the pilot testing in one of the region in the KOICA. And then we successfully to register this project in the UNFCCC CDM projects. To develop the holistic approach, it is essential to consider the value chain of the target technology sector and also the structure of the stakeholders. So as you can see this slide, this is the example that UNEP described the structure of the holistic approach for the waste sector. Actually, you can see the value chain and the bottom line, and also you can see the stakeholders and the upper line. And this holistic scheme base can be modified for the target area. So, for example, for agricultural sector, the holistic analysis and design scheme can be updated like this slide. So if we want to apply on innovative climate technology on elements of the value chain, for example, let's say a production part, it may make complex impacts on other elements. For example, if we use a smart farming in your productions, consuming the less nutrients, also enhance the recycling of the nutrients, fertilizers in your farming, actually it can impact the upper streams in the input resources for fertilizer producers. So they have the less chance to sell their fertilizer to the farmers. So it can be negative, but also it can be positive when you apply the new technology in elements of the value chain. So, and also you can see the several stakeholders. Some of them will be happy with the new technology adoption, but some of them maybe have their different thinking, opinion. So it is very important to apply this scheme to analyze and design your technology application. Recently, next slide, please. Recently, CTCN released a TA for Indonesia to identify and design climate-smart agricultural technologies. This TA was requested through Indonesia NDE by PPPT. And PPPT actually the largest research institute in Indonesia and our very close collaborator. Initially, they wanted the smart farming technology in their nation. And then my agency, my group, recommended to first analyze the problems caused by climate change and identify the potentials and challenges adopting ICT in agriculture sector. And then they found the CTCN-TA is one of the best cooperation initiatives and requested this TA to CTCN. Finally, they and CTCN developed this very beautiful TA scheme together. And then they are in the progress to select the international consultants to conduct this TA. Actually, I'm very excited to see this progress since my agency and PPPT are also preparing another joint research project supported by Korean Ministry of the Science ICT to run a pilot testing with the smart farming technology in Indonesia. And this joint research project probably make the high synergetic cooperation with the CTCN-TA. So to wrap up my presentation, I would like to highlight that the holistic approach enhances technology innovation, social innovation, and financial innovation, which will make more sustainable development in the countries. Thank you.
Thanks, DJ. That's really, really interesting what you're doing in Indonesia. With the farming, and there is, there's a lot of buzzwords in Australia that we talk a lot about regenerative farming now. That's very, very popular, what people talk about, and people wanting to be sustainable and try and be more resourceful with what we're using with our own products and delivery here. So I think there'll be some really interesting questions for you in the chat. I did have a question for you though, which I thought would be good to just, expand that out a little bit more. And I wanted to know what you felt would be a key starting point to apply the holistic approach that you're talking about with the, for the climate technology cooperation. What would be a way to start with that if you were wanting to do it elsewhere?
Okay, it's a very great question. Actually, it's very first, the starting point to apply the holistic approach is, I believe, that to analyze the problems and issues in a holistic approach. Let me make this point clearly with the example of the waste sector. So in many cases, our partners ask us to help them adopting, like, for example, waste treatment facility, for example, landfill or waste to energy in their the country. And then actually the issue is not just about it cannot solve by just having the treatment facility in the nation, because the waste treatment is just a downstream part. And in order to solve this problem, you should analyze the problem issues why you have this kind of the issue in your sector. For example, in many countries, they have the issue with actually issues in the upper streams. They don't maybe they may don't have yet like some source segregation system or the payment system for discharging payment as much as they discharge their waste, or there will be not enough recycling facility. And then this kind of issue in the upper stream accumulated, and then finally they boom up, having very huge issue in the downstream. So as you can see in this slide, maybe you can see, okay, we have this issue as we can see that, and please remove this stone. But when you look at this issue more closely in the holistic approach, you can find you have the more complex structure under this stone. Yeah, so if you remove one of the stone, everything can be collapsed. So that's why it's very important to have the holistic approach to analyze the problems and the issues that can be connected very closely. And then there is a starting point to design the technology application scheme in the target area.
Fantastic. And I guess it all highlights about communication, educating people how to communicate so that you have that flow when you're talking about, upstream, downstream, and what's happening in the community. I think that's obviously, a really, really important factor with anything with the approach and what you're talking about with the holistic approach. Really fascinating, and love what you're doing. It's really very important, and it's great to hear. And, with this being our third session, we've had some terrific information about what's happening in South Korea and how advanced South Korea is in their steps forward in lots of different areas in being sustainable, climate change, waste reduction. It's very impressive, and thank you so much for your presentation. So I'll keep moving on now. So thank you, DJ. We'll come back to you later. I'll move on now because we've got our third and final speaker, which is Mr. William Bloomfield. And so Mr. Bloomfield is the Acting Director for Climate Innovation and Investment at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Just a little bit about William. He is an Australian diplomat and has had postings and missions in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Very nice job, I must say. And he's currently focused on climate innovation and securing trade and investment opportunities for Australia as the global economy moves towards net zero emissions and becomes more climate resilient. William contributed to the development of the Australian National Hydrogen Strategy and other climate and emission reduction policies such as the Technology and Investment Roadmap. Today, he's going to be speaking about Australian climate action and global collaboration. Over to you, William.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you all for taking the time. It's wonderful to be part of this panel. Thank you. It's a great honour to be part of the panel with Professor Howden, who's been working for decades on these themes, provided a really insightful and nuanced view on an historical perspective on Australian climate action, and also JD, who gave a fantastic presentation about the holistic approach to technology collaboration. Today, I want to talk to you about just a snapshot of some early trends, some trends in Australian climate action and how we're collaborating globally. But first, let me welcome you to Ngunnawal country. I'm calling from Canberra, Australia. This is Ngunnawal country, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of the country here and their continuing connection to land, sea, and community. Pay our respects to them and their cultures, and to elders past, present, and emerging. In line with our Indigenous diplomacy agenda, I'd like to just start by focusing a bit on Indigenous Australia and climate action. And just to note, the hashtag Heal Country, we recently celebrated the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Week, NAIDOC Week, and that was the theme of the week, which I think is very pertinent. Indigenous ranger groups manage around 20% of Australia's land and sea country, and they protect native and endangered species and caring for country and culture. And I think recently there's been a funding allocation over 7 years, a long-term funding allocation for 100 million to dedicate to Australian Indigenous rangers. So I think it's a really great example of how Indigenous traditional knowledge can help support environmental outcomes. Next slide, thank you. So one example is the of Indigenous Australia and climate action is the changing fire patterns in what we call in Australia the top end, which is the northern part of Australia, which covers across northern Western Australia, Northern Territory and northern Queensland. Through Indigenous techniques for fire management, which are essentially early dry season fire management to avoid high intensity wildfires later in the season, has enabled the changing fire patterns to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect natural and cultural assets, and have a whole host of co-benefits. It's a successful demonstration of how Indigenous knowledge is contributing to Australia's emissions reductions and providing a lot of benefits. So some of these benefits include Indigenous employment, supporting Indigenous people to return and to remain on their country, biodiversity protection, transfer of knowledge to younger generations, maintaining Aboriginal language, and others. We're now exporting that knowledge through the International Savannah Fire Management Initiative, exporting this knowledge initially through a pilot program to Botswana in Africa, and looking at now other countries that we can work together with on that. The other, you can see how over the last decade or so in that graph on the right-hand side, how the late season wildfires have reduced significantly because of the increased early season burning. And just in the bottom right, you see the Time magazine headline, where the headline asks, could the world's largest green energy hub redefine how companies work with Indigenous people? And I think it's a very exciting time in Australia, because some of the scale of the projects in terms of green hydrogen and large renewable energy projects such as Sun Cable that Professor Howden mentioned, this is 50, this one in particular is talking about the Western Green Energy Hub, which is talking about a 50 gigawatt green hydrogen export project. And it reflects the scale of the future plans and the ambition of Australian business in many respects. But I think the really important part of this is how it is seeking to engage with Indigenous people. And as we develop out large-scale renewable energy and other projects, clean energy projects, it's really important that we get this right. Next slide, thanks. So really just a snapshot to add to Professor Howden's presentation on what's really happening down under. Firstly, I think the graph on the left side, you can see that the size of the carbon markets are rapidly scaling, so this is supported through what's known as the Emissions Reduction Fund. It's one of the world's largest and most robust carbon offset schemes. It's a voluntary scheme, and it's seeking to incentivize businesses and land managers to adopt new practices and technologies. This is the mechanism that supported these Indigenous fire management techniques and projects. So there are various methods under this emissions reduction scheme, including for vegetation, landfill, savanna burning, as I mentioned, agriculture, transport, and so on. In 2021, the Clean Energy Regulator is developing 5 priority methods: soil carbon, carbon capture and storage, biomethane, plantation forestry, and blue carbon. We're also looking to support the development of carbon offset markets in the Indo-Pacific through the Indo-Pacific Carbon Offset Scheme. Second, in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see Climate Active and Australian Climate Service. So it's really focused on getting information to people and to businesses and to communities. So Climate Active is an Australian government program to encourage and recognise leadership in voluntary climate action, enabling individuals, businesses and government to gain recognition and certification. The Australian Climate Service is been recently established, and that's really drawing together all the considerable scientific expertise across Australia in the Bureau of Meteorology, the CSIRO, Geoscience Australia and others to really provide tailored services through more informed emergency response, and to also inform long-term planning for infrastructure, housing and basic services like power, telecommunications and water. As Professor Howden mentioned, the renewables have grown significantly on Australia's national electricity market. In the last quarter of last year, they are around 30% of our generation capacity. The Australian Energy Market Operator has set an ambitious aim to reach 100% at any point by 2025, and there are a range of reforms about what the energy market will look like post 2025 to integrate increasing levels of renewable energy. I think the really interesting is also there's a strong level of individual and community and family household buy-in. 1 in 4 Australian homes have rooftop solar. This is the highest global uptake in the world, and there's been a series of reforms recently under the hashtag Smart Solar on really what's the next step. How do we increase that? We've seen some projections of potentially up to 3 in 4 Australian homes with rooftop solar, but also how do you integrate electric vehicles, vehicle to grid technology, batteries into the grid. Now, renewable energy, as it grows as a proportion of the grid, there's a need for integration technologies, and this is supported by a range of strategic investments. So one of the largest energy storage projects in the Southern Hemisphere, Snowy 2.0. We say Snowy 2.0 because Snowy Mountains, which are just to my south, was a large hydroelectric scheme in the second half of last century. So this is a long duration storage mechanism that's being invested in, and the construction has begun. There's a range of transmission to enable solar and wind to be shared around the distribution, ensure that balance in the system, and also a range of large scale batteries. We've had one of the largest batteries in the world operational in South Australia, and there are a range of other batteries in planning and in construction. And just finally, that there's Sun Cable. There's a very exciting prospect for Australia to play a role in exporting renewable energy, particularly to Southeast Asia. And next slide, thank you. So the Australian government's approach is really focused on how to get to net zero and developing the practical, scalable solutions to enable Australia to reach net zero while partnering with other countries to decarbonise and grow our economies. So the government's approach is very much focused on a technology-driven approach to position Australia as a low emissions technology leader, building on Australia's existing role as a trusted exporter of energy, resources and agricultural products. So one of the key areas of focus is really reducing costs of new and emerging low emissions technologies so that they can become cost competitive. Removing this green premium, as Bill Gates likes to call it, is key really to widespread global adoption of these technologies. So the government developed a strategic technology investment roadmap. It's really a strategic view of future investments, and what the process has done is to identify 5 priority technologies, which are clean hydrogen energy storage or long duration energy storage, low carbon materials such as low carbon steel and aluminium, carbon capture and storage, and soil carbon measurement. And these were selected really because of their potential for transformative economic and abatement impacts both in Australia and overseas across multiple sectors and applications. So they can significantly, if we manage to increase global uptake of these technologies, we can significantly reduce global emissions from across energy, transport, industry and agriculture sectors, which account for around 90% of global emissions. So these are accompanied by what are called stretch goals. They're ambitious economic targets where they are competitive against existing approaches. And just to reiterate, the bottom left, you see the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation logos. They're the primary mechanisms for investment, and it's really about encouraging co-investment as much as possible. But beg your pardon, to ensure that private sector invests alongside public sector to reduce this green premium. Next slide, thank you. So we really just want to give a snapshot of some of the areas and the ways in which we are partnering for global impact. So the first area is the technology partnerships, and this is led by our former chief scientist, Dr. Alan Finkel, who's a special advisor to the Australian government on low emissions technology. He plays a key brokering role. So far this year, we've concluded partnerships, technology through decarbonisation through technology rather, with Japan, with Singapore, with UK clean energy partnership with Germany focused on hydrogen. And I know we're speaking and we're collaborating very closely with our Korean colleagues to really work out ways how we can accelerate deployment of low emissions technologies and unlock new economic opportunities. I think another area is transparency and integrity in emissions management and carbon markets. It's obviously important that when countries and companies commit to targets that the emissions inventories are of a high integrity, so that people, when they're investing in those to avoid greenwashing, that we can ensure that those emissions reductions are taking place. But also to work, Australia's had, as Professor Howden mentioned, Australia has had a long-standing national inventory and high standards, and it's really collaborating to share that knowledge. We've done so with a number of countries in Southeast Asia and Africa, and we're continuing that work through the new Indo-Pacific Carbon Offsets Scheme. The other area is through climate finance. Australia's pledged 1.5 billion Australian between 2020 and 2025, which is a 50% increase over our previous 2015 to 2020 commitment. Over 70% is directed to adaptation and resilience, and we've got a very strong focus on the Pacific. We have an Australia Pacific climate partnership, which focuses on integrating climate and disaster science and information services into Australia's aid program to support the Pacific. And just to mention the new Australia Climate Finance Partnership, it's taking that co-investment approach to Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and it's really seeking to using blended finance models to mobilise innovative private sector investments in those areas. And I might just finish on the nature, oceans, biodiversity and adaptation leadership. I think understandably emissions reduction is a natural focus, but there's a whole range of initiatives in Australia on these areas. I think on oceans, on supporting blue carbon ecosystems through the International Partnership for Blue Carbon. We're a founding member of the International Coral Reef Initiative, lead partner on global forest observations initiatives, and we've just joined the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. So there's a whole range of areas where Australia is engaged. And I think Australia's leadership is built up really on the scientific excellence in Australia, and this is through exhibited in a number of programs and national environmental science program. We're in the agriculture space. We're current chair of the Global Research Alliance for Greenhouse Gases, and doing some really interesting things on agricultural biodiversity pilot programs to try and encourage farmers to promote biodiversity on their land. Next slide, thank you. And very keen to stay engaged, and you can follow our Australia's Ambassador for the Environment on Twitter, but happy to have any discussions. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, William. Oh my goodness, there's so much really good information there on that slide, the slide before your last one. And I was going to say, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to want to reach out to ask some questions and want to get involved and see how they can partner and do a lot more with what you've spoken about with the different initiatives that the government is providing, which is very exciting and positive action that we can do. It's interesting that you mentioned about science, and that was what Mark also mentioned about listen to the science. The science is there, and that's what we should be working towards as organisations and entities and government departments working together with the technology that's being delivered, and also with what DJ was talking about with the agriculture. So it's really interesting that you're all talking the same lingo and bringing it together, and you are working together, but maybe it could be merged into one, so it's not in different silos, which I think is one of the issues that we always talk about with governments as well. And I guess that brings me to my question to you is, obviously as a diplomat, and your focus is on climate change, what's your personal perspective on what we call our webinar, No Time to Waste? That's our theme. And what would that mean to you?
Thanks, Vanessa. Great question. I think it's a really pertinent theme, No Time to Waste. Obviously, the latest IPCC report and the framing of it as Code Red has really highlighted the urgency of action. And I think the real message that I also took from that scientific report was that the agency that we have to avoid the worst possible impact. So we really need to connect and collaborate in new and exciting ways and radical collaboration. I've been very fortunate in my life to have lived in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and I find that often it's those simple connections that one can make to really facilitate people who are thinking about similar things, where there are some really exciting initiatives that may have resonance in other countries and may have resonance. So I think it's really about taking a really energetic approach to trying to connect and collaborate. And I think the other final thing from a personal perspective is that there's some really interesting research on, the interdependence of both individual and systemic change. Obviously, we need systemic change across our energy, food, transport, industrial systems to achieve net zero emissions. But the role that individuals play in, whether it's their backyard planting microforests or adopting new technologies to reduce emissions is not to be sniffed at. It's something that's important, and I think we can all play our role in helping to catalyze those changes that are necessary. Thanks.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And as you said, what we can do in our personal life. And I know that you do, while you've been in lockdown in Canberra, I believe that you have been growing some of your own plants with the microforests that you just mentioned, which is really fantastic, again, that you're doing your bit and walking the talk, as we always say, which is really terrific. So thank you so much for sharing your information with us, and as I said, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that'll be in contact with you, like all of the other speakers. And what we'll do now is I will hand over back to J1, who's going to now moderate and ask some questions to all three of our speakers. So thank you so much, and over to you, J1.
Thank you, Ricky. Let me just unshare my PowerPoint slide so we can have all the speakers back to us. So if you can put up your, yep, that's great. I'm looking forward to see Dogu, John as well. Do you want to put yourself back on? Brilliant. So this moderate question time is to actually welcome all the questions that had come through the chat box today while you're presenting. I'm going to start backwards. So maybe I'm going to start with William and DJ and Mark. So William, there was a comment from one of our audience saying that as the Article 6 would be the most challenging issue for the upcoming COP26, what kind of plans do you have on the Indo-Pacific carbon offset scheme? So if you can give us a little bit more about the detail, yeah, that would be brilliant.
Yes, thank you, J1. So yes, you're 100% correct. Article 6 is obviously one of the key areas that needs to be sorted out to finalise the Paris rulebook, and it's certainly a priority of Australia's as we approach the negotiations in Glasgow. In terms of the Indo-Pacific carbon offset scheme, it was announced earlier this year in April. And it's an investment of around $60 million, and it's to help set up a high integrity carbon offset scheme for Australia and countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So it's really aimed at boosting public and private investment in climate action and helping Australia and countries in the region to meet their international climate change commitments. So we're really in an early stage design phase. Design phase, and really talking to the interested countries to help develop the capacities and also to share the knowledge on that. So I think it's something that I think we'll be focusing a lot more on as we go forward. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the reply. I can see that that scheme is specifically focused on capacity building and knowledge sharing, and I'm pretty sure the audience of today's webinar, there will be people who will be interested to actually see the applicant coming in and then go for it. So yeah, thank you, William, for your answer. Question to DJ. So we had a question from our audience saying that, can holistic approach be applied to a single project or a program which includes more than different projects?
Okay. Yeah, so today I only talk about the project level holistic approach. And the holistic approach can be applied in the program level as well. Actually, in fact, it is very essential to apply holistic approach in the program level, even the policy level as well. So, for example, when you have the green policy, adopting new solutions and the technology in your society and nation, actually it can affect a lot of things to the many stakeholders in the many elements of the value chains. For example, if we have the renewable energy, there be, of course, the very positive impacts with the renewable energy, but also it can be quite the threatening the challenges to the carbon-based the energy sector. And then you can analyze the impacts, the complex impacts of these the new technology adoption in the other area with the holistic approach, of course. And especially when you use this holistic approach in the program level and policy level, you may need to apply macroscopic the viewpoint rather than microscopic viewpoint. And also you may have the more numbers of the complexity of analysis and design factors in your approach. One more thing, that's why it's very important to have the very good communication with the general public when you apply holistic approach in the policy level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your great answer. Yes, I do feel the importance of communication, and it kind of links to the question that I'm going to ask to Mark. So there was an audience asking asking actually from the Bangladesh talking. He wants to hear your thoughts on how to communicate climate science properly to general public. I also had a couple of other questions that I wanted to ask, but I think that will be the final question for today's session. But Mark, please, yeah, your time to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a couple of principles that I sort of apply. One is you need to connect with their own knowledge. So one of the things is that people often have their own experience of events, you know, when cyclones might have hit them or when a big flood might have occurred. And then you can actually start to engage with them about how representative that is of the current risk associated with climate change, and explain the processes that are driving change in that particular event. And so you can move into a domain where you try to engage with them and increase their knowledge of of what's going on. So through understanding the processes. Now, oftentimes this actually ends up a bit of a two-way description, because often there's additional information that people have that isn't necessarily embedded in the formal knowledge, the scientific knowledge and the statistics and data that we have. And that then can really often contribute to much better solutions, because you can start to take into account local context in terms of how to deal with the changing risks. And so for me, we start from the known and then move into the unknown. And oftentimes we need to just accept that there's many knowledge holders in the domains that we work, and it's important to respect the knowledge of other people. So respect the knowledge of Indigenous people, of farmers, of coastal zone managers, of politicians and policymakers, as well as scientists. So it's not as though scientists are the only person there. Now, one of the really important questions that is raised in the chat is the question of attribution. So people blaming a particular cyclone on climate change. These days, there is actually some really great attribution science that's being done. So people can attribute the human influence on things like the Northwest Pacific heat wave almost in real time. So it's a very near real-time attribution of climate change. So, in that particular case, it was assessed that it was almost impossible to have occurred in the absence of human-induced climate change. So that's one approach to sort of starting to have that conversation about what is a climate change signal. And the other one, I think, is a conversation that says that, in fact, climate change is embedded within almost all of the climate-related extreme events we're seeing. So whether it's floods or fires or heat waves, there's a climate change signal embedded in that. And so rather than sort of try to strip it out and blame this part is on climate change and this isn't, I think we just need to accept that in fact that there's an embedding process which has happened, and in fact we almost now can't separate out extreme events from climate change.
Thanks for your great response. Yeah, we cannot ignore the holistic impact on this Earth with the climate change. It is embedded in everyday life with this critical time. So yeah, it was my great pleasure to actually have all three speakers on board today for our final No Time to Waste webinar. I think I was pretty stressed about the COVID stuff and things like that, but I never been happier to actually host this webinar. So thank you, Ricky, for co-hosting with me. Our next series will be announced soon, so watch space, and thank you for joining us today all over the world. I got hello from Saudi Arabia, USA and Bangladesh, all over the world, which was fantastic. The podcast will be available on the Plastic Oceans Australasia website, and the event video will be available on Social Marketing Griffith YouTube channel. So until we see you guys again, please stay healthy, stay warm in Australia, stay cool in Korea, because we got a backwards climate there. So yeah, hope you guys have a great rest of the Tuesday and rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks, Jawan. Thanks, Ricky.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, William. Thanks, TJ.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.